Good morning, and welcome to Critical Considerations Before Contracting with a Teletherapy Vendor. I am Mary Robertson, and I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Marketing for the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, or MEHC. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, and I hope the sun is shining where you are, as it is in Minnesota. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. We're recording this conversation, and we will post this to our website as soon as we can. We welcome all questions. Please use the Q&A box. There is a chat, but if you would put the questions in the Q&A box, that allows us to track them better and get back to you. We always appreciate your feedback, so we can improve all of our future convening. So if you would, please take our survey at the end. We are joined by our esteemed panelists who will explore the dynamic realm of teletherapy and delve into the critical considerations that institutional leadership should bear in mind when entering into agreements with teletherapy vendors. I'd like to introduce Dr. Nance Roy. She serves as the Chief Clinical Officer of the JED Foundation and is an Assistant Clinical Professor at the Yale School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. And she has over 20 years of experience as a psychologist working in college mental health. And she is the author of the brief, Critical Considerations Before Contracting with a Teletherapy Vendor. Also, Dr. Zainab Okolo is the Senior Vice President of Policy Advocacy and Government Relations for the JED Foundation, where she is a higher education policy and mental health expert, advocate, and educator focused on helping students overcome barriers so they can learn, earn, and lead fulfilling lives. Prior to coming to JED, she was a strategist with Lumina Foundation. Dr. Hollie Chessman is the Director of Research and Practice and the resident college student mental health and well-being expert at the American Council on Education, or ACE. She joined ACE in December 2018, and she brings almost 20 years of professional experience in higher education. And Dr. Veronica Warren is the Counseling Center Director at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. She is an experienced program director for collegiate professional and who has streamlined and implemented innovative processes and procedures. She has expertise in fostering strong relations with youth and college students as an educator, counselor, and advisor to improve their performance and quality of life. And finally, I am pleased to introduce MEHC President Susan E. Heegard, who will moderate this session. Susan?
Thank you, Mary. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And the sun is shining here. It's balmy by Minnesota standards. It's about 50 degrees outside, so we're pretty happy about that. So we're a Midwestern compact, and for those of you who don't know what a compact is, it's basically law that stems from the Constitution and allows one state or many states to work together on various issues. So ours is really the Midwest Census region. We stretch from South Dakota over to Ohio and south to Missouri and Kansas. And our leadership includes both policymakers, so legislators and governors, policy advisors, as well as higher education leaders, so campus leaders and system leaders. So we're very unique in that respect. We have two sides of our business, really: cost savings programs and contracts, and then policy and research. This is something that really sits in the policy area, but of course, since we're talking about vendors, there's a contracting opportunity that the folks here will talk about with you. One of the key things that I think we bring to the table is our ability to convene, and which is what we're doing today. Sometimes we convene in person. And of course, as we learned from the pandemic, for better or for worse, we're able to convene virtually, and we're getting so much better at it, aren't we? I'm pleased that on this call today, we have folks from student affairs, academic advising, academic leaders, and the deans of students across the region. So I'm just thrilled to have all of you spending time with us today. You're on the ground doing the hard work, and we have so much to learn from you as well. It's critical for me to note that we're not endorsing a specific provider, and I'm going to use the word provider instead of vendor today. And so our purpose here is to introduce the brief Critical Considerations Before Contracting with a Teletherapy Vendor. Nancy and others here contributed to that, but Nancy, what great work. Mary is going to drop the various reports that we're talking about in the chat. This session, as she mentioned, is also recorded. And if you have any questions for us afterwards, please feel free to follow up. So Nancy, could you kind of, I like to sort of start things out by level setting and sort of laying out the, providing a landscape. Where were we before the pandemic as it relates to student mental health? We've heard that the pandemic kind of spurred things, but in addition to that, are there other things that caused this change? And as noted earlier, why is this an issue now? And please talk a little bit about your brief. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So, I mean, clearly everyone sort of woke up to the fact that mental health was a concern during COVID. But it's not to say that we weren't seeing continuing rising trends in mental health among our young people before COVID ever, hit our streets. So, we've been seeing, I'd say at least for the past 10 years, probably longer, we've been seeing rising trends, especially around anxiety and depression among our young people. And then, of course, there was a spike during COVID, and the silver lining of COVID is that, in fact, it did rise to the top as issues that people were concerned about. And Hollie can talk a bit about the surveys that ACE does with college presidents, and for the past 2 or 3 surveys that they've done, really top of mind, mental health being top of mind for our senior leadership, which actually really helps to move the needle on addressing this issue on our campuses. So certainly growing trend, spiked during COVID. And I will say, in addition to COVID, if we pause for a minute, because I'm often asked the question, why now? Why is everybody, so anxious, and our young people so anxious and depressed now? And I like to just say, well, why don't we just stop and pause and look around at our world, and the world that these young people have grown up in, right? They don't have a context to put this in where there was a time that our world was stable and friendly and loving and kind, right? They've grown up with school shootings, with racial hate crimes, with violence, with, natural disasters. I mean, this is not a safe world that our young people have grown up in. So frankly, I always say I'd be more worried if they weren't anxious, because their anxiety and depression is a natural reaction to what they see going on around them. So I think there's a combination of factors. And, I guess I would also say that the other thing that we've certainly seen grow and certainly started a big movement during COVID was the teletherapy opportunities that have come onto the horizon, because everyone went remote and we needed opportunities to continue to provide services. And certainly teletherapy became essential at that point, and folks have actually taken to it. And so I think many schools are now looking to, or already have employed, teletherapy on their campus. And so we'll be talking about that as we go on through the morning.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, I think I was going to say, just to kind of build up what Nancy had mentioned about our surveys, we surveyed college and university presidents throughout the pandemic to learn about the trends and issues that they were facing on their campuses in order to inform the decisions that folks were going to be making around different COVID related things, as well as around mental health. And one of the things that we saw in our survey, like Nancy alluded to, is that student mental health with enrollment and with long-term financial sustainability are the 3 things that university leaders indicated were top of mind for them. And so I think it's really important to mention that. And the reason the brief came into fruition in the first place, and the reason we asked Nancy to write it, is that we are getting inquiries from college and university presidents about, what I'm getting, so much information from these different people in the field, these vendors in the field, or different providers in the field, how do I make the decision about what is the right vendor for my campus? And so I approached Nancy at the Jed Foundation to sort of say, hey, Nancy, I know you do a lot of work in this space. Can we get sort of a handbook together to think about what are some of the key questions that you should be asking your institution, and also asking yourself and your students about how to best select a provider for your campus?
That's great. Thank you, Hollie. Zainab, can you talk a little bit more? Nancy touched on this about the urgency around this topic, and then I know that when I first heard about teletherapy, I probably heard it from my kids because they were on campus, and then from friends and their kids, and professionally I heard about it. But what are some of the misconceptions around teletherapy?
Absolutely. So first, touching on the urgency, I think Nance and Holly covered a couple of great points, but when we think about what pushes us towards ensuring that access to key practitioners and resources is really at the top of mind of leaders, we have to look at the data. Currently, according to the CDC, suicide remains the second leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 14. Third leading cause of death for youth ages 15 to 24. Why are those? Well, first of all, that data is enough to take a pause about how the world around us, as Nance mentioned, is really impacting the way youth are engaging, whether or not they have hope for their future, and whether or not they feel like there is something to thrive towards and for. When we think about how we used to think about therapeutic services or even receiving therapy online prior to the pandemic, there were a lot of restrictions from a licensing standpoint. So as a licensed practitioner myself, even if I had a client or two that I saw on Zoom, I had limitations according to my licensing board. Thanks to the pandemic, we flexed some of those regulations a bit. And now, as we think about the demand that folks have on needing consistent resources, there is no other way for us to really meet the demand without employing the use of teletherapy, engaging with online vendors, but ensuring that we're engaging with folks that, number one, are truly licensed, understand the work, that it's not just a business model shift, and that understand the urgency, which again, we have literal lives at stake. And what we know about hopelessness, particularly with youth at these pivotal ages, 10, 13, 14, 15, 16, when they seek out services and they can't find the help that they need, we are now in a critical situation. We also want to think about ways in which we can prepare institutions for having these conversations. So I think the positive part of even this panel here today is that we're elevating the opportunity for us to not shy away from some of the language barrier as what we mean and what we are trying to invoke when we say mental health services are health. That framing and that lifting of stigma becomes pivotal because again, it guides how we engage the work, it guides how we fund the work, and it guides how it continues to be prioritized well after the moment of, for example, the pandemic moves along.
Thank you, Zainab. I was one of the things, you said lots of really important things, but one of the points I remember reading in the report was when somebody's in crisis, the data reflects that they need to have access within 24 hours or less. And that what we know about, on campuses, the wait times are several days, a week, sometimes more than a week. And so the teletherapy, my understanding from what I've read is that allows for campuses to expand capacity and address issues much more in real time than before. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, Susan. Actually, data out of AUCCCD takes note that, before the pandemic, the average wait time for a student in crisis to get mental health services was around 1 to 2 months. And back then, that was egregious. That was egregious because if you're dealing with anyone in crisis, as you just mentioned, 24 to 48 hours is where we need clear intervention. Since then, it's grown to about 6 to 8 months. So 6 to 8 months, and institutions are saying, we definitely want to help our students, but institutions simply don't have the capacity to meet that kind of demand, given the wait list that they have with in-person supports. We would have to quadruple our counseling staff across all of our state institutions to even begin to think about whittling down those wait lists. So in the midst of that, the urgency presents a great opportunity for us to engage in platforms that are valid, that have, you know, licensed practitioners behind the firewalls that can address the needs of students, particularly those that are in crisis.
Thank you very much for that. Veronica, I'm anxious to get to you, but I want to, because you're living it on your campus, and we have so much to learn from you, but I wanted to talk a little bit with you, Hollie and Zainab, about our organization, as I mentioned, is made up of both policymakers. So we might have some lawmakers and their staff listening today, as well as higher ed leaders on campuses leading, systems, but also the people that are on the ground doing the work. So I'm always thinking about, how do you talk about something in a way that resonates with both of those groups, right? Do you have any guidance for those leaders, whether they're a lawmaker, right? They're making financial decisions about appropriations and things like that, and how to best serve the institutions in their state or they're in their community, or for the leaders who are working in those areas. Do advice and guidance for those folks as they're trying to make decisions. You've touched on that a little bit already, but I'd love to hear more.
Sure. I think one of the things that, as folks on this call know, and probably folks who are joining us know, ACE is a presidential membership association. And so our members are college and university presidents. And one of the things that we've been working on at ACE is to get information into the hands of college and university presidents so that they can advocate up to their governing boards as well as their state representatives, but also to alleviate some of the burden that is associated with doing this hard work on the ground as a director of a counseling center, or as a dean of students, or as a counseling center person in general. And so one of the things that I think that is important to be thinking about when you're thinking about this topic as a policymaker and as a board member is that you can't afford not to invest in student mental health. I think one of the things that is important to realize is that there are returns on investment as it relates to student mental health. And I think Nancy's going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. But one of the things that we know is that not only do institutions reap the benefit of keeping a student enrolled, students also reap the benefit of having increased lifetime earnings due to not stopping out or dropping out. And so there's a really great case to be made for saying to your boards and to your policymakers, like, we need to invest here. And Zainab talked about some really compelling data that shows, that anxiety and depression have increased, and trauma, Center for Collegiate Mental Health is showing that trauma has increased, and we're only going to see that number go up as people report how the pandemic impacted them. So these are things that cannot be thought about. And one of the things that we highlight in our brief that we just released about a week and a half ago is that we need to build on the momentum at the federal and the state level. There are really good states doing really good work in this area. And I hold up Utah in the brief as an example of that, as well as the system of Georgia. I also hold up the fact that the Biden administration in particular has been very, very proactive in student mental health and in mental health as a topic in general. And so it's a really good time for policymakers to be advocating up their chains to say, hey, we could use some additional funding here to address this really significant and important issue on our campuses to keep our students safe, to keep our students enrolled, and get our students to be thriving citizens of our country. So I think there's a lot of different things to be thinking about. And there's a lot, and as a person who's a boots on the ground, there's a lot of opportunity. I think Veronica can talk about this, being that she's, directly addressing this issue on her campus. You can't afford not to address it. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. Not addressing this issue will significantly impact not only the students' health and safety, but it will also impact the bottom line of your institutions.
I love that, Hollie. Thank you very much. And you're referring to the reports. Mary's dropped them into the chat, and we'll also, of course, make those available later. But let's talk Senior Leadership and Student Mental Health and Counseling Centers brief. There's also a webinar through the link, and then 6 considerations for student mental health in higher ed for the 2023-24 academic year. And you had a great article in Inside Higher Ed on November 7th as well. So Veronica, you represent one of our Midwest institutions in Wisconsin. that utilizes a teletherapy provider. Can you talk about your situation as an institution that's part of a system? What are some of the challenges you faced? I'm sure there weren't any. And who's been involved on your campus, and how did you deal with the multiple levels and communicating? Are there, and at the end, of course, are there any lessons learned? Veronica?
Awesome. So the University of Wisconsin System Institutions, which is about 13 four-year institution and 2-year campuses, in 2022, our governor allocated about $5 million in American Recovery Plan funds to help support additional access to mental health for students. And we were no different on many of our campus were experiencing an increased number of students who needed access to care, and we needed more crisis support. And so our system was specifically seeking support around telecounseling to expand the number and of diverse counselors, as well as availability of hours for counseling. So looking at after hours as well as possibly on the weekend. Another thing that our system was very specific about in looking for telehealth providers around telepsychiatry, because a lot of schools might not have that support, or the amount of staff or the limited hours does not provide enough support for students that need psychiatric care. Also on-demand support for intervention in regards to triage care and managing crisis for 24/7. And lastly, looking for an evidence-based self-help resource that allows students to develop their skills while managing mental health and well-being on their own. And so at the time that this happened in 2022, our campus here at UW-Whitewater, we had been consistently understaffed since coming out of the pandemic. We were beyond the recommended therapist-client ratio. We were seeing still about 8% of the college campus population. And so we did have some of those further out scheduling difficulties and trying to get students in for care. We did have a vendor that we were working with for after hours crisis support, but that contract was about to end. But one of the things I think that was already starting to go in our favor is at the beginning of 2022, our campus administration agreed that they wanted to prioritize mental health on our campus. And we entered into a partnership with JED. And so when this came up, our campus administrators were really supportive of this initiative. And so when you talk about who was a part of the initiative, although I led the implementation, our chancellor was very involved as far as being supportive of this initiative happening. Our student affairs, a senior student affairs officer was also engaged. We had to identify with our IT support team how to do one sign-on and all of that to make sure we were in compliance with security protocols for the self-help platform. And then around our university marketing and communications and bringing on how we were going to market this new telehealth vendor to our campus. And one of the other things I think when you talk about challenges is how do you get the buy-on from staff that's doing the job every day to let them know this is an extension of our services, is not a replacement of services, especially when they see the data around our learning outcomes and satisfaction survey, as well as our University of Wisconsin impact system assessment that says that students still want in-person programming, but they would like telehealth as an option if they needed telehealth. And so making sure that our staff was also buying into needing this additional services to provide support to our students. And so the other challenges I think that we need to make sure when we're looking at telehealth support is what is unique about your campus culture and the needs that your students have. And so when we think about University of Wisconsin systems, and I talked about there are 13 four-year institutions, we all function different, and there's a uniqueness in that. And so at the time where I was experiencing a large turnover, there were other campuses that might not have been experiencing a turnover in staff the way I was. And so they might want more support around the self-help module platform. And so just really understanding how each campus is unique, ask questions of the vendors about your specific campus needs, what your students are saying, what they would like around mental health services. So communication is the key. I think when we launched as a 13 institution, we launched in groups. And so there were 4 different sections, and you were put in a group of when that launch was going to happen. And I was a part of the first group, and it was 3 weeks from when the contract was essentially signed until launching. And so not having a lot of time to create policies and procedures around how would counselors refer or students refer, what that would look like in regards to how do we monitor that students are kind of double dipping in services where they're trying to have on-campus services here, but also engage telehealth services. Does a case manager need to be hired, or does the case manager need to monitor certain support? So those are some of the considerations that came up as well. Also understanding and asking questions about the different types of assessments that the telehealth providers use with clients and how that might differ than the type of assessments that we're using, especially if those assessments are being used to say if a student is in scope or out of scope. And that was something that we had to navigate as well, because then we were having students that came back to us that indicated that they were not necessarily in scope with that provider. And so having to be able to pivot in that way. Also understanding about what type of reports they would be providing that will offer you the leverage to talk about the need to continue with a particular vendor and or telehealth services in general. And what does that data say about your particular institution, and being able to use it in a very beneficial way. And
Thanks,
so
Veronica.
I think,
Thanks. That's great. I wanted to just, before I forget, touch on, you talked about, the provider doing an assessment, but I know that we talked a little bit earlier about, and you touched on this, assessing the needs on your campus. You want to have, it's not a one size fits all thing. I mean, while there's some common things that need to trend across and cut across all in terms of quality, et cetera, it's really important to understand your students and your campus. So how did you assess that? How did you assess your campus needs to figure out what you needed? And then, after that, you could work on the buy-in and that sort of thing. But how did you do that?
yeah, and what's interesting, because this was a decision by the system, I don't know if each individual campus really got an opportunity to assess the need in the way they needed to. And so I think we had to rely on some of the information that those 2 reports that is both are put out by UW system, but one is launched at the campus level. And so I think we had to really rely on that data we were receiving and the feedback that the students were saying about what they wanted around specific care and what that looked like. And so it looked a little bit different, I think, if we had a little bit more time to really understand, to put out an additional type of survey, maybe if it was like a climate report or something around mental health. But I think using the data that was already at our disposal.
Great. You also touched on staff. And so not to be cute here, but when you're on the airplane and they say, make sure you put your mask on before you put your mask on your kid, which I always never thank God had to do. But in this case, I'm thinking about the people that you've mentioned here, whether they're faculty or they're mental health staff, working right with the students. I've heard about burnout and challenges there. There's a report also that's been provided by ACE called Addressing Burnout Through Cultural Change, How Leaders Can Stem Attrition and Support Employees. It's critical to be able to do that. I'd ask anybody, any of the esteemed panelists here to talk a little bit about how would you advise campuses to, they're racing and worrying about how to serve students. How do they serve their staff so that the staff can then in turn effectively serve the students?
I wanted to follow up. It's related to your question, but follow up and highlight one of the things that Veronica touched on around, it's around our staffing. And so often I think health and counseling center staff are overlooked in these bigger decisions. And they are the people that know what the students, what issues are the students presenting with? What are their needs? Do they need more telepsychiatry? Do they need more psychiatry services? Do they need more, whatever it is? So in addition, certainly to surveying students directly, it makes sense to include your health and counseling folks because they are the ones that know what the students are struggling with on their campuses. And so I just wanted to be sure to make that point. And then as far as faculty and staff burnout, I was actually just giving a talk the other day and this came up. And I think, and JED is all about, our approach is definitely campus-wide. Everyone on campus has a role to play in supporting student mental health. And so often I think that we inadvertently ask non-clinical folks to engage in work that they feel ill-equipped for because we make it seem like they have to be clinicians to reach out and do this work. And in fact, that's not what we're talking about at all, right? We're talking about noticing when someone's beginning to struggle, reach out with a gentle, warm hand, refer if they reveal something acute. But the other thing I think that contributes to faculty and staff burnout is think about all that they have on their plate, right? Especially faculty, when you think about their evaluation process, for example, they're evaluated based on how many grants did they get, how many research publications do they have, were they in prestigious journals? I mean, they're dancing as fast as they can to advance in their career on the metrics that they're being evaluated on. And to date, I have heard of very few institutions that have in their evaluation rubric how they're best supporting students, right? And so, I think institutionally, we need to think about that. We're asking people to do certain things, and yet we're not valuing them in terms of reward or support to do it. And so I think those certainly lead to burnout as one of many factors that result in what we're seeing, not to mention that everyone went through the pandemic and pretty much everyone I know had their own stressors, whether you were home with little children and also trying to teach or do research, or were taking care of, elderly parents, or you yourself were sick. So, again, sort of to my point earlier about I'd be worried if young people weren't anxious. I kind of think it makes perfect common sense that people are burned out, faculty and staff included.
I think just to add a piece to that, this is why messaging is so important for leaders. Currently, JED has a partnership with the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, where we've put together a mental health learning community by which we are, at the end of this year-long learning community, producing kind of a best practices for policy leaders around the framing around this work. And one of the things that we've already grappled with, that the 5 states that we're engaging with are already considering, are ways in which we do not treat faculty and staff as simply worker bees towards addressing the youth mental health crisis. They're not. This is a human level issue that impacted everyone, as Nance mentioned. And what we're finding is that stigma did a fantastic job for the past 5 decades in making folks feel ashamed and unheard when it came to very basic mental health needs. And what the pandemic did was, as a collective trauma, disrupt all of that. So before we even think about mental health 101 packages for faculty and staff about how to best recognize key risk factors within their students. We have to do the same by empowering them to recognize when burnout is happening for themselves and pointing them towards where they can get the supports that they need. And this is some of the conversation that I know ACE has been having. I know definitely Jed has been thinking through, just making sure that we do not skip over the fact that we are dealing with humans when we're dealing with faculty as well.
Yeah, if I can add one more thing too. And when I talk about UW-Whitewater and when we engaged Jed as a partner and we launched the Healthy Mind Survey, this is why it's so important to have the buy-in for your campus administrators all the way up at the top and the cabinet level. Because one of the things that they did not want to just focus on student mental health, but the welfare of faculty and staff, and launching the Healthy Mind Survey for faculty and staff for our HR department and administrators to really take a look of how to better support faculty and staff well-being as well. And so that's why buy-in is so important.
And to sort of jump on what you all have been talking about, that's why you need to take a systematic public health approach to addressing mental health on your campuses, right? It's not a one-off. It's not just like, here we got a counseling center, we're just going to hire a vendor to help augment the counseling center services, because this mental health goes beyond the counseling center and the counseling center's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility on campus. And in that context as well, thinking about the impact of mental health on faculty and staff and is important as well. And Mary dropped a couple links in the brief that we talk about on addressing burnout has some strategies, and we know that we've got to change the culture at our institution. So thinking about a cultural shift and a cultural change to thinking about what are we expecting our faculty and staff to do without support? What are we expecting our students to do without support? And how can we get the support in place? And the 6 considerations brief mentions the Healthy Minds Assessment that Veronica just mentioned, but also the NCHA, which is the National College Health Assessment, which gives you a broader view of mental health. Or not mental health, but health in general, but also mental health. And then you've also got the Wishes survey, which is a short free survey that allows you to sort of get a quick snapshot of where your particular populations are on your campus. And it's really important to disaggregate that data to get at like what students are thriving and what students are struggling. And then there's another one from MHEC, which is a campus climate survey that you can give to your faculty and staff as well as to your students to sort of assess what is what does the campus climate feel like around mental health and feel around health at this moment, to sort of get an assessment of like, what are the things that we're facing on our campus right now, and and then make a plan to potentially address that.
Hollie, once again, can you mention where those 2 assessments or the guidance, where are those found again?
They're found in the 6 considerations brief.
That's
There's
right.
links to them in that 6 considerations brief. So all 4 of those assessments. So you can check that information out.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So let's move on. Nance, I'm really interested, as you mentioned before, in this concept of ROI, and I'm not just talking dollars, the money, right? It's part of return on investment, but it's really about productivity and effectiveness and the welfare, of folks on campuses. So you've done some work with respect to the value proposition of higher education with regard to mental health. Can you talk about that, the calculator that you have? I think Mary dropped it into the chat, but the impact of investing resources, both time and money, in student health, and what it might mean for student success.
Yeah, so actually it is a calculator and a product that was developed by Daniel Eisenberg, who is the PI for the Healthy Mind study. And he is both a public health guy and an economist, which is sort of an interesting combination. And he developed this economic case for investing in student mental health. And, briefly, and the calculator is available for free online for folks if they are interested in doing so. I have used it myself. I was on campuses for many, many years before joining JED, and I've used it myself with college presidents, cabinets, boards, and it actually so clearly shows the disproportionate sort of equation of how much it costs to invest in mental health versus how much it costs in terms of losing students when they're not able to make it to graduation. So it's a calculator where if you put in your number of students that leave for mental health medical reasons, those that come back, numbers that come back, numbers that don't come back, ones that make it to graduation, ones that don't, it actually calculates for you not just tuition dollars lost, to your point, but also um, income generation potential for students that do or don't make it to graduation, alumni giving for students that do or do not return or don't make it to graduation. And it clearly shows that for a very small economic investment in mental health, there is huge savings in terms of what is lost if we're having students leave for mental health and medical reasons. And we know that apart from maybe financial struggles and difficulties, leaving for mental health reasons is at the very top of why many students drop out, and some do and some don't make it back to school. And so to your point, it's not just sort of the economic advantage for schools, and certainly for school leaders, that's their job, is to keep their institution solvent and to get students all the way through to graduation, retention and graduation rates. And certainly those are the same things that students want. They want to be able to make it through. They need the support in order to do it. And then with the appropriate supports, they're able to stay in school or return when they feel in better equipped if they've addressed their issues and can make it to graduation. So it's a win-win for both the institution and the students.
Thank you, Nance. I know we've got some questions waiting, but I wanted to, I think we've talked kind of at a macro level, but I wanted to also touch on this relationship with the provider or the vendor. Can you talk a little bit about the things to think about as we've talked a little bit about selecting, but how to think about the relationship with that provider, and perhaps the advice or lessons learned there as well for any of you.
Well, I think Veronica touched on this, and I hope you can speak to this more directly from your experience. But, one of the important considerations is to think about how much communication and information sharing do you want between your health and counseling center and whatever vendor or provider that you choose. Some schools want to know every time a student reached out to a provider, they want to know certain, whether it's diagnoses or notes, or are they being prescribed medication, and others really may only want some cursory data that is shared. So thinking with your providers on campus about what will be the responsibilities. That's the other thing. If a student is in crisis and they're talking with a teletherapy vendor, how is that information conveyed to the institution? To whom? Where do those channels lie? What are the protocols for responding in those kinds of cases? So I think it's key to think all of that through before you choose a vendor, because there will be some that are very willing and they have protocols already set up to have extensive communication, and there are others that don't. So that is, for me, I think, one of the biggest takeaways that we've heard from schools. But I'd be interested in what your experience is, Veronica.
I would even say that both the provider or the institution and the vendor have to be open to make changes. And so even in going through this process, there has been some times where we thought maybe more information and some of the documentation needs to change. And so the vendor has been very open in trying to change and adapt to our needs at the institution level. So you will want a partnership that is willing to adapt on the fly as we're learning more about what is important to us to receive information back on. And I think communication is the key.
Yeah, I'm just going to add one other thing with this communication piece, and that is not to forget to communicate to your students who may be using the teletherapy platform if in fact the information they share with that provider is going back to the counseling center at school.
Yeah.
And
so that was one thing that we had to do in regards to the informed consent, making sure our informed consents are aligned with what the vendor is putting out as well. So there was some adjustments that we even had our legal department through the system review and take a look at.
And I think just looking at the question that just entered the chat about legal considerations, it's for these very reasons that Veronica and Nancy just mentioned, that sometimes institutions kind of avoid this topic like the plague, because there's a lot of liability involved in what we're making students or availing to students, and whether or not this is the fits. And I think we want to be clear, as was already mentioned in the brief, teletherapy is but a tool that should be placed in a larger system and continuum of care for students. So it requires all of us to, first of all, acknowledge that beyond utilizing these resources to support students in the now, we should also be aware of our physical resources around us, so that if we're temporarily having students engage with a platform, for example, if they need additional supports, we should be able to triage that. And this is one of the steps in that larger triage. I also want to make mention of the fact that a lot of the things that we're doing around this work, again, we are building as we climb. Our system, particularly to the systems of higher education in general, K-20 on through, has never actually been in the opportune place to think about the different variables that go into creating a true systemic approach to mental health. And so the opportunity here is, yes, let's move with the data that we have, but we can't get frozen in the things that we don't quite know yet. The opportunity here is to kind of partner across functions and systems that we otherwise have been siloed in, as we do our best to meet the needs not only of our students, but also of our faculty and our staff on campus.
And can I add one more thing in regards, and I think Nancy brought this up about making sure how you communicate with the students that are receiving services. And so one thing that we do, we talk about our vendor as an extension of services from our center, right? Not like they're this separate entity, but they're able to offer care in a different way to meet the students' needs. And so I think the way you language that is very important, but also letting students know that if they are in crisis, we are still here for them, that we're here in person to support their needs, provide for care. And I think packaging is everything. And so when we started out, because of our students provider ratio, we really needed to use our telehealth provider because we were scheduling far out. Now with a fuller staff, not so much, but once again, if a student needs more support, whereas after hours or on the weekends, great option for telehealth. We're finding that where our campus is located, we border Illinois. And so we have students that are in our online program. And so telehealth is great for them because the telehealth provider has counselors that are licensed in the state of Illinois. And so there are ways that even when the referral process isn't going in one way, you can market to your online students or market in a different way to make sure they are still getting services from that provider.
Thank you, Veronica. I have a couple questions. I want to make sure we respond to that. And then Hollie, we'll have a teeny bit of time at the end to kind of follow up, but we've got a question from Kate. How are schools funding teletherapy? We have legislative funds, but I'm interested in how integration happens with schools that might have counseling centers that utilize student health insurance. And then there's another question from the state of Missouri. I want to respond to that as well. Anybody have any thoughts about how our schools funding teletherapy?
Initially, there was a lot of, we heard of like the HARE funding, the Higher Education Emergency Relief Act funding was a big boon to help support that. I know that institutions, what we've heard from our presidents is that they're looking for alternative ways to potentially fund that work. But initially, a lot of it was done through the federal Emergency Relief Act funding. Other folks might have other other things to add to
Yeah,
that.
and then building up on that momentum that Holly just mentioned, governors and states started to pull aside specific funds targeted at mental health. Some as modest for a state, of course. I don't want to sound like a complete millionaire here, as budgets as $2 million towards the state, and some more grandiose, like $1 billion, $1.5 billion towards mental health. And part of that percentage would go towards the education chancellor. So this is what birthed the partnership that we now have with SHIO to help those state SHIOs figure out what to do with these brand new budgets targeted at mental health, and thinking about ways to sustain those budgets and make sure that we target that funding towards actual opportunities to meet the needs of the day. Because of course, if those are not spent down, then we have concerns for the following budget.
And that's where that ROI, that information, that assessment, and then providing that assessment and then the feedback to those who fund, right, is so critical. We've got another question in the chat. The state of Missouri does not currently have any statutes or regulations that require private colleges and universities that do not participate in Title IV to have policies for student mental health support. Effectively, these students have no options for mental health support from their campus and rely solely on local community programs, private counseling services, or their family physician. How can these students lobby effectively to call for better support from these types of private schools who have no legal requirement to provide it? That's an easy one, right?
I always said when I was on campuses that administrators listen to students. When students, they're the consumer, they're your customer. And if we're not listening to your customer, you are not going to have any customers. And so I think as much as staff and faculty can help support students to unite and have a clear and strong voice that they are presenting to, whether it's the president or the board, that my experience is that they listen. And if you even look at, most recently, different student groups going on strike or joining, forming unions to get their needs met. I think it's usually around salary and things of that nature, but it's sort of an example of what can get done with a collective voice from young people who get guidance around how to do this well. And
you're saying, Nance, you're saying start at the grassroots level. It starts with the students and the customers. Their voice needs to be heard, both on their campus, but probably also to the policymakers, that represent that area. Yeah.
Along with the data that's so clear about what they're struggling with. And in addition, the information we've already talked about of what's at risk for the institution when they don't pay attention.
Great. Okay, there's two more questions I want to just be mindful, and then I want to make sure we leave a little bit of time at the end here. But there was a legal question, but I'm gonna go to the second one before I go to that one, because I think you touched on some of those legal considerations. Are students generally satisfied with telehealth for mental health services? Is the service meeting the needs of historically underserved students? That's critical. Availability of practitioners, types of practitioners, days of the week, times of the day, etc. So how do you find out whether your students are satisfied, and are they?
Well, you certainly could easily do surveys to that effect, but I think the more important piece of that question is the far greater opportunity that teletherapy providers allow for in terms of diversity of providers. I mean, schools just can't hire enough diverse providers to adequately represent all of the different populations on their campus, whereas teletherapy providers can have a very large panel of people from all different groups, whether it's race, ethnicity, identity, so that it's far more likely that a young person will be able to find a provider like them or who they believe will understand them best, if it's just common sense that there's more opportunity for variety and diversity when you have a larger provider pool, and most institutions can't do that on the ground.
Well, we have a few minutes left here. I would like to offer an opportunity for you to bring up anything that we haven't, covered, or any questions that weren't asked that you think it's important for us to share with our audience today.
One of the things that I'd like to mention, just it was sort of building on some of the points from earlier. We're talking a lot about teletherapy vendors and counseling centers being intermingling, but I think that what's important also to point out is that our systems also have community colleges that or other institutions that don't have a counseling center, and so that's something to sort of be mindful of and be thinking about the relationship that you would want with your provider as it relates to being a potentially a non-clinical person. So I think it's an important sort of consideration to be thinking about. And one of the things that the brief that Nancy wrote sort of talks about is, if you have a counseling center, these are the questions to be asking your students. And if you don't have a counseling center, these are the questions that you should be asking your students.
Oh,
because
I love that. It's great.
Because that's important to sort of, be mindful that if those who aren't used to having the resource available or don't know the resources available, it's important to understand what they're looking for before thinking about what sort of services you're going to provide.
I would just add to that, many campuses that don't have counseling centers, and those that do as well, but especially in response to Hollie's question, are hiring case managers or care managers, so that there is a point person that isn't providing direct services on campus, but can receive information from a teletherapy provider, that if the student is needing additional support on campus, they can help to coordinate that so that there is an identifiable unit or person on campus that can be a sort of an intermediary.
I think there's a significance in just saying that no matter where your state or institution is in having this conversation, that everybody has a role to play and an opportunity to participate. I've spoken to states that, again, have larger, more robust budgets, more integrated approaches to work, and states that honestly, kind of from a post-vention perspective, are in response to a tragedy, are starting to think about ways in which to engage. And the one thing I think that we all harped on here today is that messaging matters. Don't be afraid to grapple with the data, with the report or the reports that we've shared, and get out the message that mental health is health and that it is important to you and your system leaders. That is the first step to supporting our youth, is acknowledging what they say they need and then moving into solution finding and partnering. So looking forward to continued conversation around that as well.
Veronica, did you want to add anything before we wrap up here?
I think everyone summarized everything we've talked about really well. Yeah.
There was a question we're not going to have time to get to. There was a question about peer advising. Is that covered in any of the briefs that we talked about? No? Okay.
No, but the Mary Christie Institute has a whole body of work on peer advising, and peer
Okay,
counseling.
great.
So yeah, Mary
Great,
Christie
thanks.
Institute.
Great. We'll find that link as well and provide that to folks. So I want to just thank our panelists for this great discussion. This was really, we could have talked for hours. In our preparation for this, we covered lots of ground, and I still have lots of questions. And so I just want to express my gratitude to each of you for the great and important work that you're doing for campuses, students, and the folks on campus who serve students all across our country. For our attendees, we'll post this video once it's available. We'll have links to all the publications and reports that were mentioned today. And if you have anything that you'd also like to follow up on, please feel free to contact us. Mary, am I forgetting anything?
Nope, you covered it.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, both our panelists as well as our attendees. I am very, very grateful to you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.